Voltaire, in particular, wanted the end of Christianity. He wrote that Christianity is the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. He also said, "It took 12 ignorant fishermen to establish Christianity. I will show the world how one Frenchman can destroy it." By combining the principles of Christianity with Voltaire, it is as though Adams is saying that the general principles of the founding of America were both the principles of God and the devil at the same time. With this in mind, consider that Adams once wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "I should have given my reason for rejoicing in Voltaire and company. It is because I believe they have done more to propagate religious liberty than Calvin or Luther." Voltaire and Rousseau were so closely associated with the American founders that they are shown in this image beside Benjamin Franklin, as if they all represented the same ideals. But when men like Voltaire spoke about liberty, the freedom they wanted was to be free from Christianity. Is it possible that such a view influenced men like John Adams? The answer largely depends on how you define Christianity. If you study the founding fathers and the Enlightenment thinkers of this era, it's important to pay attention to the word religion. Okay? Because the word religion to them has to do with a framework of morality. When they say religion, they don't mean what we would mean today as Bible-believing Christians in the world today. What they mean by religion is just a system of conduct, really. They don't mean the testimony that Jesus is the Son of God and so on. And so, for men like John Adams, the Christian religion did not mean the gospel. Even in his lifetime, Adams himself knew full well that his doctrinal views were rejected by Orthodox Christians. He said to them famously, "Ye will say, I am no Christian. I say, ye are no Christians." And there the account is balanced. As said before, Adams was a Unitarian, and the Unitarian belief specifically rejects the doctrine of the Christian Trinity, the idea of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Adams wrote that the Pythagorean as well as the Platonic philosophers probably concurred in the fabrication of the Christian Trinity. Furthermore, Adams did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or that he was God manifest in the flesh. He said, "The Europeans are all deeply tainted with prejudices, which they can never get rid of. They are all infected with creeds and confessions of faith. They all believe that great principle which has produced this boundless universe came down to this little ball to be spit upon by Jews. And until this awful blasphemy is got rid of, there never will be any liberal science in the world." The reason Adams rejected the doctrine that Jesus is God was because of his view that God is unknowable, and therefore, for the Bible to say that the person of God was revealed in Jesus Christ was to him an awful blasphemy. Adams wrote to Jefferson that, "When we say God is a spirit, we know what we mean. Let us be content, therefore, to believe him to be a spirit, that is, an essence that we know nothing of." But where did Adams get his belief? The pagan origin of his faith was revealed by him in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, where he made reference to an allegedly 5,000-year-old Indian book, the Shasta, the first book of Brahman theology. He said, "Where is to be found theology more orthodox, or philosophy more profound than in the introduction to the Shasta? God is one, creator of all, universal sphere. Search not the essence and the nature of the eternal, who is one. Your research will be vain and presumptuous." The Eternal willed to communicate of His essence and of His splendor to beings capable of perceiving it. The Eternal willed, and He created Burma, Vitsnau, and Sib. These doctrines, Adam says, sublime, if ever there were any sublime, Pythagoras learned in India. In contrast to Adam's belief that God cannot be known. In the Bible, Jesus said, "And this is life eternal, that they might know Thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom Thou hast sent." In Hosea, God says, "For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." And while Adam's Shasta says it is vain to seek God, Jesus said, "Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened." It was during the presidency of John Adams that the much debated Treaty of Tripoli was signed. The treaty bears perhaps the most contrary statement against the idea of the United States as a Christian nation.
And the Treaty of Tripoli is, I think, the clearest declaration that the original founders of the United States of America did not believe that they were setting forth a Christian nation. Why? Because they specifically said so in this treaty. And what you have are patriots, diehard patriots, who will try to spin the Treaty of Tripoli and somehow or other state that it doesn't mean what it says. But there's no, if you read the entire treaty, there's no reason for them to come right out and say that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. There's no reason to say that if they don't mean it. So they declare this, and according to the history, it was unanimously agreed to on the floor of the Senate. Now, why was it unanimously agreed to? The question, of course, is, well, wait a minute, where were all the Christian founders to leap to their feet and to lift up a shout against this treaty once they heard it? You would think that there would be at least one Christian who would have jumped up and said something. The answer seems to come from a Christian man named Dr. Bird Wilson. And Bird Wilson was somebody who had spent years of his life investigating the faith of the Founding Fathers.
In a famously controversial sermon he preached in 1831, Dr. Wilson said, "The founders of our nation were nearly all infidels. When the war was over, the Constitution was framed and God was neglected. He was not merely forgotten. He was absolutely voted out of the Constitution. The proceedings, as published by Thompson, the secretary, show that the question was gravely debated whether God should be in the Constitution or not. And after a solemn debate, he was deliberately voted out of it." Dr. Wilson went on to say that those who have been called to administer the government have not been men making any public profession of Christianity.
And he's saying this in the early part of the 19th century. It's important to remember, not all of the Christians, when the American Revolution happened, the impression of many church leaders was not that this was a Christian revolution. The impression of many leaders was not that the revolutionaries were Christians who were somehow or other following the example of Jesus and the apostles by launching this revolution.
The absence of Christians in the early American government would explain why no one objected to Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli. Yet while this treaty was confirmed under President John Adams, the origin of Article 11 may represent the unkindest cut of all. According to 19th century historian Moncure D. Conway, the controversial Article 11 was drafted by none other than George Washington. Conway said, President Washington, the first time he ever came in treaty with a non-Christian people, Tripoli, sent to the Senate a treaty which opened with the following: as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. There is the statement, Conway says, from the great Washington. The Treaty of Tripoli was drafted toward the end of Washington's presidency and then confirmed under John Adams. If Washington himself authored Article 11, it would further explain why no one would dare to question it. But also compels us, as we continue this journey, to investigate the real faith of the man who was at the heart of the American Revolution. Undoubtedly, the most famous person to have survived the American Revolution is the man known as the father of our country, George Washington. But was he a Christian? Many die-hard patriots would say so. But even during his lifetime, Washington's true faith was a mystery. And there were many who sought out a clear answer as to what he really believed about God and about Jesus Christ.
There are some who put forth about Washington, they'll say that nobody ever questioned his faith in his lifetime, or that nobody ever questioned whether or not he was a Christian in his lifetime. Now, this is provably false. Washington was the President of the United States. And while he was president, he was well known for getting up and walking out of church on Sundays when they did communion. He was well known for refusing to partake in communion.
We read that the Reverend Dr. Wilson, in his famous sermon on the religion of the presidents, says, when the Congress sat in Philadelphia, President Washington attended the Episcopal Church. The rector, Dr. Abercrombie, told me that on the days when the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was to be administered, Washington's custom was to rise just before the ceremony commenced and walk out of the church. We further read that the doubt rests again on the recollection of Nellie Custis, General Washington's step-granddaughter, who states that the general was accustomed on Communion Sundays to leave the church with her, sending the carriage back for Mrs. Washington. The reason Washington sent the carriage back for his wife is because Martha Washington was a regular partaker of communion.
But he would get up specifically and leave the church. And at one point, his pastor, the Reverend Abercrombie, confronted him about how he was setting a bad example for others.
In his famous sermon, Dr. Wilson wrote that Washington's refusal to take communion became a subject of remark in the congregation. In a letter, Reverend Abercrombie wrote that, as pastor of the Episcopal Church, observing that on sacramental Sundays, General Washington went out, always leaving Mrs. Washington, I considered it my duty in a sermon to state the unhappy tendency of example, particularly of those in elevated stations who uniformly turn their backs on the celebration of the Lord's Supper. I acknowledge the remark was intended for the President, and as such, he received it.